right. It is 10:45, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker today. I think we have some people coming into the room right now. Hello, everybody. My name is Valerie Vanlin, and it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sean Austin to everybody. He is a research associate in the Educational and Community Supports Research Unit in the College of Education at the University of Oregon. He received a PhD in special education from the University of Oregon and has practitioner experience as a school psychologist with Heartland Area Education Agency. His research focuses on positive behavioral interventions and supports, professional development, and implementation science. I think we're all excited to hear about your presentation today. Sean, let me know if there's anything I can do. I will be going off camera and on mute and monitoring the chat.
Great. Thank you so much, Valerie. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see so many of you filtering in here, and I expect that'll continue to happen, as does with a lot of these online trainings. But I'm really excited to be presenting for you all today on the topic of school refusal. This is something that, as Valerie mentioned, I was a school psychologist practitioner in schools, and so I found this topic to be something that I managed and tried to plan for quite frequently in my last few years in practice. This became some of my most involved individual cases. And so I do have a good amount of experience that I'm bringing, in addition to a lot of what the research is showing and what the experts are telling us is a good starting point for supporting students with these kinds of needs. So fortunately, I don't have to introduce myself much more because Valerie did such a great job there. But yeah, I am at the University of Oregon. My practitioner experience was about 5 years in Iowa, and primarily middle schools and high schools. And so my role as a school psych is primarily supporting special education. And so the students that I was supporting around school refusal were often in special education or in the process of being evaluated for that. So a lot of the content today will focus on those individual students that have lots of needs, but I'm still going to address the idea of chronic absenteeism as something that can be small groups of students or even a school-wide issue based on school data. And so I look forward to a comprehensive conversation about that. As we are moving through here, I may ask for some chiming in from you all via the chat, but please feel free to use the Q&A function. It looks like it's a tab over, and you can ask some questions or just pin some questions there for us to go over at the end. All right, so the objectives for today are to define and explore some trends in absenteeism and school refusal. Then I'm going to discuss assessment of school refusal. And last, we're going to identify effective strategies for overcoming school refusal. I will say that 75 to 90 minutes is not quite the amount of time I would love to have to talk through all of these. So I won't be able to give you everything I would love to in that amount of time, but hopefully it's enough to get you started and give you a strong sense of direction with what you can do both school-wide and with individual students. First, before we get any further, I do want to give a special thank you to co-authors on a brief that was published through the Center on PBIS, School Refusal Assessment Intervention, sharing the same title. The lead author, Stephanie St. Joseph, who has the distinct pleasure of having her face plastered on the slide, was the lead author here and was fantastic. In addition, Kathleen Strickland-Cohen, Wendy Mahalchuk, and Kent McIntosh, all fantastic co-authors here. And so I want to thank them for their contributions to making that possible. And so this brief, if you have not seen it, is on the PBIS.org website. And you're welcome to check that out there. I think I do have a link toward the end of the presentation where you can review that. And Jessica Daly is on top of it already. Thank you so much, Jessica. You're amazing. So without further ado, let's get into the background and trends in school refusal. And as always, you want to define your terms. And so for us today, I'm going to define school refusal behavior as child refusal to attend school and or problems remaining in class for the whole duration. Now, admittedly, that is a broad definition and that is intentional. As you are probably aware, attending this session, you've heard a lot of different words for kind of the same thing. Other labels might be truancy, chronic absenteeism, non-attendance, school avoidance, even defiance. Dropout is another one, and one that I see research is moving more toward over here is more push out instead of dropout. The idea being that students aren't, of their own volition, they're not maybe feeling connected and are feeling pushed out of school instead. So some other capturing terms there. You're welcome to use what you feel fits best, but for the purpose of this presentation today and consistency with the brief here, I'm going to use school refusal. So I would love to know what some examples of school refusal that you've observed would be. At the very least, I want you to think about at least a couple cases in your own mind that you were working with this past school year, or you anticipate working through this school year. And the case can be school level. It can be school wide. It can be a group of students that you're trying to figure out how can I reach them a little bit better, or it can be individual students, as it often was for me in this problem solving piece. So if you have a case that you're thinking through, a few brief details, you can chime those in the chat. Otherwise, just keep that in the back of your mind as we're working through some of these assessment pieces and these intervention pieces. What I do want to acknowledge here is, of course, we have a continuum of school refusal behavior that we're working through. On the front, I would say, like on the initial stages, what this might look like is students are clearly stressed, not really invested in their attendance, or asking, sometimes begging not to go to school. Sometimes this will look like more externalizing behavior, acting out in a way to avoid going to school at the start of the day, but can escalate to periodic absences, repeated absences, all the way down to complete absence from school for an extended period. And I'm sure if you've been in schools for any length of time, this is one of those things where you've seen this whole spectrum. I do think this is a really good point to acknowledge that the state of Michigan and the Michigan MTSS Center has shifted, with like defining here the range of school refusal. It requires thinking differently about student behavior that we can affect. Oftentimes, as a practitioner, if the student was in special education, I didn't hear about them to help problem solve, even though I probably could have been really helpful for identifying what are some of the student's strengths, what are some malleable things that we can affect that might get the student to the school building. They were often kind of left to their own devices, and parents were left to their own devices. And so Michigan's shift from social emotional and behavioral wellness or intervention to social emotional behavioral health, I think expands more into this domain of, we are here to support holistically the student, and that includes getting them into the building. I know individual educators often feel that responsibility, but I just want to acknowledge that this is something system-wide, statewide, that we can acknowledge, this is part of our charge, is to try and get students into school so that they can participate. So when I look at the prevalence, I was underwhelmed with the amount of data that we have at our disposal. So I want to acknowledge that up front. But this is one of those things that is a little bit more difficult to measure. You're trying to measure who's not there. And if a student hasn't registered for school, then they don't count, but they still might be a part of these numbers. So these numbers are going to be students that have been registered, have attended at some point probably, but then stopped, or have stopped intermittently. So back a decade ago, if you can even remember back that far, it seems like a lifetime ago. What we found in research here, a couple studies indicated that truancy rates on average were around 11%, and that means 11% of students were skipping school at least once in a month. This was more often found in students who identify as female, or students of color, or students of sexual and gender minorities. And more often, this is going to be in middle school and high school compared to younger ages, although that's not to say it's not present in the elementary age as well. Now, obviously, that was a long time ago. I was trying desperately to find something more recent. There's not a ton of research, but there was at least one accounting that I could find through the Associated Press of absenteeism kind of post/peri-pandemic. So coming back from the pandemic there in the 21-22 school year, found that chronic absenteeism defined as missing at least 10% of days. So you're seeing this shifting definition, which I'm sorry, that's just kind of the landscape here for measurement. But about 28% on average across the country were missing at least 10% of school days at that point. And I'm sorry to say that Michigan seemed to be a bit higher. Now, that is something that I expect has probably come back down a little bit over the last couple years. But, first of all, I don't have verification of that. Second of all, I want to acknowledge that there are some students that might just not have come back. And that's something that we're aware of nationwide, is that this extended absence from schools meant some students just didn't feel comfortable, didn't come back. I know homeschooling has been something that's been more popular as well. That wouldn't be included there necessarily. But all this is to say, if you're attending the session and you're in Michigan, just know that you are in good company of people that are actively pursuing what they can to remedy this issue and get students back into the building, into class, and learning. So when we look at kind of what are the things that underlie truancy, what are at least the associations that we find in research, student and family factors, such as like student self-regulation, even parent involvement, are relevant in terms of being protective of truancy. So students that have better self-regulation or more parent involvement are more likely to be attending school. Perceptions of safety at school, so whether or not a student is feeling safe in that environment is a predictor. Those are not particularly surprising, but good to know. School level factors, high rates of suspension are associated with increased truancy overall, and that bears out at the individual level too. If you're suspended in school, you're more likely to drop out by the end of high school or be pushed out. And then also peer and neighbor influence. So you've got peers that are skipping school. You tend to be more likely to do that as well. Other barriers to attendance that are really important to acknowledge, and this comes from SPRIC and SPRIC, which is they have a handy book on chronic absenteeism and school attendance for school leaders. They point out a handful of issues here that are important to acknowledge, I think more broadly, right? Illness, physical problems, like maladies that affect you in an acute way that can keep you from school, that are not, just refusing to go. Like these are actual, like this would interfere with your education if you were in school. Transportation problems is another one. If you can't get to school, hard to attend. Like there are going to be other barriers that are outside of this behavior individual problem solving approach. And so it's important to acknowledge that, and we'll get to some suggestions for addressing that systemically as well. It's important to acknowledge that there are often obligations outside of school for our older students, sometimes in the form of childcare for siblings or for their own children, and also just family obligations that they can't get out of. Sometimes it might involve work as well, thinking about financial issues. Last one that I want to acknowledge is sleep, especially for our morning chronic non-attendance issues, specifically for our adolescent students. Like circadian rhythm is a real consideration, and a lot of schools have moved toward later school starts for our adolescent students for that reason. And the last on there is these idiosyncratic behavioral issues, which, like I said, this is what I think draws a lot of people to a presentation like this. And that's what we'll spend quite a bit of time on today. Now, the topic of school refusal, I believe fundamentally is a matter of equity. And so this is an equity statement that comes from the Michigan Department of Ed and Michigan MTSS Center, which describes equity as having access to, meaningfully participating in, and having positive outcomes from high quality learning experiences, regardless of individual characteristics and group memberships. And I think acknowledging the struggles that it is to get some students into school, and acknowledging that those struggles do not happen uniformly, as I've just shared, addressing this systemically and even on an individual basis is going to do a world of good, I think, to meaningfully improving access and participation in school. So I'm really excited that this presentation aligns so well with that. In addition, the Michigan MTSS Center has this MTSS framework and components that they've outlined, and I think you will see a lot of alignment here in terms of a tiered delivery system, selection and assessment, and then continuous database decision making. All are key parts of my presentation today, and I think you'll readily see that. So, digging into assessing school refusal, hopefully this general problem-solving model is pretty familiar for most of you. You've probably seen some version of it. I like this one primarily because it's simple and it's easy to present. So there are some that are a little bit more complicated and more complex. They give you more steps. But fundamentally, what we're trying to do when we're solving problems, first we have to identify, is there a problem and what is it? Next, we're going to identify, well, we've identified this problem. Why is it happening? What's going on here? And then after that, we have to identify, well, what's our plan? What are we going to do with it? What's that plan going to look like when it's implemented? And then lastly, we always need to evaluate whether or not our plan is working. And so that's that fourth step there. And I've found overall that it works so much better than this model, which some of you may have tried before. I think every one of us has probably tried this, maybe not in our professional lives as much, but you're trying to hope the thing that works. And if you don't mess with it and it doesn't work, then you might not know what it is. But overall, we want it to do something a little bit more systematic than that flowchart. It is a model, though, I will acknowledge. So, problem identification, is there a problem? This gets to assessment fundamentals for me. And so these are Sean's fundamentals here of assessment, the things that I think about when I'm going into to support a student case or even a school-wide case. One, I'm going to go through this continuum of investigation through RIOT. If you haven't heard of that before, that's review, interview, observe, and test. That is something that all school psychologists, in my experience, have been trained to think about as an intensity of investigation, where you're typically going to start on the first few letters and then test only if you need to, because that's going to take students out of instruction. And testing can look a lot of different ways, but it means like direct assessment, sometimes with measures of the student. Other things that I'm going to think about, and I encourage you all to think about, is what is the scope of the problem? How many students are involved? What is the topography of the behavior that the students are involved in? And so on. Function is the next one, and that one's going to be crucial, and we're going to spend a lot of time on that today. What is the function of behavior? What maintains it and continues it going? And then intensity, like how intense is this behavior, and how much of our resource do we need to invest in it to help turn it the right way? So for this initial problem identification phase, my first question, regardless of how the referral comes to me, it could be a school-wide referral of like, we have an attendance problem and we need to take a look at it. Or it could be, we have this individual student that's really falling out here. My first question is always, what do the school-wide data show? Is this problem, like how big is the problem? So how many students are missing? How many periods? Who are these students? And if I can get past that question, identify, it's just it's just really this 2 that are missing this much or missing in this pattern, then that gives me some confidence in moving forward in a more individualized way. But there are going to be often cases where there could be an approach that we identify for a narrow student that might actually apply pretty well to a broad swath of them. So there might be more systemic changes that we can apply at our tier 1 or even tier 2 level to kind of turn this for multiple students. So I always think about that. That's kind of my lens of efficiency in systems change there. But regardless, the next step, once we've identified, okay, well, we've got an idea of scope here, is like, well, how do we measure that? Like, is there a way that we can quantify that? We've identified, okay, there's a lot of students missing, or this one student is missing a big chunk. Quantifying for me is really important. We have then a baseline or a starting point or a way to start the conversation with others that we might be pulling in for interview and getting another sense of perspective on the problem here. So a very typical way to measure that, or to state kind of the problem here, would be a student is absent an average of 40% of the school day each week. So that gives me a pretty clear idea of what each day looks like. Sometimes you might have students that are more variable, and so you might define a range there. But overall, this is going to be pretty helpful for, again, defining the problem and then maybe tracking over time as well. Another way, if you've got students that are missing only specific periods, you might track 1 or 2 periods. So student is missing or is tardy to 3rd period math 4 out of 5 days per week. And so that tells me, again, how often is this a problem? Where specifically is that a problem? It's just a matter of like what you get a sense of for your student, like what is the most salient point that you want to intervene on, what's the most important, or if it's just an overall picture, we need to get the student back into school because they're not here. Really important point here is that oftentimes this is coming from the perspective of the school. And that's great. And we have some very important perspective to provide. But there are other perspectives that we should acknowledge. And so like, you're going to go in as a school practitioner, you might be an administrator or a school counselor or a school psychologist or a teacher. And you're like, hey, I've noticed Billy is not here for, half of the school day, most of the day, most school weeks. But you talk to the student and they're like, well, that's not my priority, or that's not, I think I'm actually here more. And so you want to get a sense of like, what's their perspective on it? Parents, same way. I think sometimes there's almost too much of an assumption on our part that like what we see is what the reality is for that student, and parents might have a very different take on the priority of school, B, the trustworthiness of school staff in delivering this information, or even how they perceive what attendance means, right? They might think that this is the acceptable level of attendance. This is what their student needs. So like getting a sense of how they view school attendance is really important. And even interviewing other practitioners as well. So this is part of that interview piece where, when you think about the continuum we've reviewed, this is going to be more of that interview assessment. I would also be prepared for non-behavioral explanations. And this is something that comes across, I think, I'm thinking back to every case that I worked in. I think every case had some physical complaint as a component of the student not wanting or not being able to attend. And so those complaints are often real, sometimes somatic, meaning that, connected to some level of emotional distress. But always be prepared for that. Take note of that. That's really important to acknowledge and address. And could be a component of this problem identification. Another way to identify or define the problem would be as ratings of distress there. And so what you see in front of you is like this pain scale that a lot of you might have seen if you visited a hospital, have someone in the hospital where they ask you to rate your pain, like what is your level of discomfort right now on a scale of 1 to 10. You can apply this to subjective ratings of distress the same way. So like, how anxious are you about attending school, or how afraid are you of attending school? This is often a contributor or a part of the conversation in school non-attendance, is connecting to some sense of anxiety, some sense of distress around school, some sense of not wanting to be there. And so if we identify that, this can be a way of assessing, okay, well, how fearful are you? How anxious are you about going to school? And this is something that I've used many times as a starting point for understanding how students view their school experience, how parents view the students' reaction to prompts to go to school, and how staff observe the student behavior. Now, admittedly, this is an internalizing behavior. It's hard to observe in some students, and I've had that where students did not present anything outwardly except for maybe a little withdrawn. But it can be a useful tool. I would add, for elementary school students, the rating 0 to 10 might not be super helpful, but they could point to one of those faces on the screen and say how they feel right now. They could be, smiley face at the beginning, or it might be like really uncomfortable, it might be that frowny face toward the end. Now, we've identified a problem, we've identified some baseline measure, and I'll get more into goals as we go through here, but we've got a sense of where the student is beginning, we've got a sense of what the problem is. Now, we want to get to the why. With any problem, again, it's been drilled into me, and I think it's just where I am always at, is like, what are the systemic levels, even for an individual student? What's the systemic availability of resources that could apply to some of this problem? So thinking about, like, if we understand that there's a lack of availability of some of these resources around mental health, if we understand that our school climate isn't great, if we understand there are environmental considerations or transportation barriers, that there are logistical concerns. Keeping those in mind as we're understanding the why is really important. And last but not least, the cultural linguistic barriers. Oftentimes, this is more difficult to assess, sometimes because, if there's a distrust, if there's a fundamental distrust of school or school staff, sharing of that distrust is less likely to come across. They might you get like a nod or a passive acknowledgement of like, oh yeah, I understand, we'll do better. But it's hard to sometimes get further into that. So acknowledging that that's a piece of it, and that might take some more probing to get to as far as a why for some cultural differences around what we think, or how we think about school. A lot of our time today is going to be spent on function of behavior. So hopefully this is something that is a familiar concept to you. If it is not, what I will briefly say on it is this is what we have as the theorized why of how student behavior is coming to exist in this specific circumstance and be maintained to make it more likely to occur again in the future. So the question that we ask along these lines is, when not at school, of what are students getting more, or of what are they getting less? And what are they doing? What does it look like? Those three questions help us inform a lot more about, okay, well, what things can we change? If they're getting a lot more video game time at home because they're not at school, is like, maybe that's something we should ping into, is like, oh, that could be the motivator piece. Or, fundamentally, if a student's not at school, we understand they're getting less instructional time, obviously. They're getting fewer prompts to work. And so two things can be true at the same time. Sometimes three things can be true. And that's what makes this problem particularly challenging at times, especially for individual students that have like high levels of non-attendance, is that it can look like multiple things at once. And it's our job to parse out what is going to be the most salient, what is going to be the most effective change that we can make for students. And sometimes it's multiple. Sometimes we can't assess any further because of time limitations or otherwise limitations. We have to use an informed guess based on the available resources that we have at the time. But fundamentally, it's about why. And if we have that why, that gives us direction. It might look like scribbles on a chalkboard of, okay, well, in this circumstance, they're doing this, in this circumstance, they're doing this a little bit differently. But overall, this is going to be math that gives us, we're trying to compute a function at the end. Ideally, we can have one that we commit to, test in a form of implementation. And with any luck, we continue evaluating our plan and we identify it was successful. So there are 4 primary functions of behavior that do apply to school refusal. And they look like this. 2 of them are going to be more escape maintained is how we refer to that. Maintaining the behavior means continues it in perpetuity. One would be escaping school-related stimuli that provoke negative affectivity. It means they don't feel good because they're worried about school. Another one that's, I would say, similar and overlapping in terms of function, maybe a little bit different in terms of how we intervene, would be escaping aversive social and or evaluative situations. So it's actually like the situation in school, not the emotional effects that you get from the idea of it. Third would be obtaining attention. And this could be positive or negative attention. And then the fourth would be obtaining tangible rewards. That means physical things that, like, it's about a physical or access to an activity that is only available or primarily available outside of school. I will say that even if we're doing individual problem solving level, that tangible needs can expand beyond what, like that narrow example that I gave there. There are tangible needs that are actual, like, really much more important than video games, right? Like sustaining themselves or family. When we think about those financial barriers, those family obligations, those are really important. It could be that tangible in quotes, but it could just be like a difference in priority that, like, as you're problem solving, you might write that down as being the function, but like ultimately what you intervene with is going to be fundamentally different in terms of trying to promote access to school, make it easier to attend, and working with the student and the family. So when we think about that first function, escaping school-related stress or stimuli that provoke negative affectivity, symptoms of that often look like dread, anxiety, depression, and those physical complaints of feeling physically unwell. The anxiety can arouse from things like bus rides. You see it listed there. Like fire alarms are often, like, the uncertainty of fire alarms can be a big a big reason. Like they can be very profound events for students that have sensitivities like that, and so they might avoid school altogether as a result. Things like playgrounds, hallways, places that are unstructured. You start thinking about like places that aren't predictable or things that aren't predictable as a way of that keeps students in their mind, keeps students from being able to enjoy or feel safe. Number 2 would be that escaping aversive social or evaluative situations at school. And this is students that are trying to avoid feeling judged or evaluated, that are feeling shy or just anxious about being in front of others. And so this involves a lot of like the interactions. Sometimes students may have been exposed to others that are verbally or physically aggressive or perceive it that way too. Or it could be like actual like performing pieces or speaking in front of others. These functions often display as difficulties with transitions due to fear. This general anxiety of, excuse me, something bad is going to happen is frequently how I've seen it described. Again, excuse me. And it's this almost generalized anxiety is kind of how you describe that. But the wording on the slide here, I'm not crazy about. Like the source is not a legitimate threat. I think what's perceived as legitimate threat is hard to hard to pin down, but the bottom line here is that they're not avoiding something due to a true bullying situation or serious harm that could be delivered to them. It's not one of those things that's realistic, or it's not something that's based in anything that we can track down. So they end up being more concerned with not being at school rather than being at home. So they're just anywhere but school is the goal for these students. Examples of what this looks like: heightened anxiety in relation to one class or a section of the school day. Sometimes it could be around PE or music class or test days. The ways that you can assess this are a couple different ways. You can look at attendance records and see patterns. If you have that, man, that makes your life so much easier. It's like, oh, what is it about this class? What is it about this class? If you've got a general non-attendance pattern, then it requires a lot of interview. And sometimes this can be really, really hard to pull out. But asking directed questions that target specific like classes, right? If you just have this like student that's generally not attending in the morning, and there are classes that rotate, asking about each individual one, if there's something specifically about that one, can solicit a little bit more feedback from the student. Sometimes they'll offer that up right away, sometimes not. But yeah, I would say that review or interview piece can be really helpful. If you can observe in settings for this might be helpful. But again, an internalizing problem of anxiety doesn't always, or even necessarily often, demonstrate in a way that you can see it. And that was a problem that I always had. I couldn't observe it very well, and so interviews or reviewing records was the most helpful. So for our third function, obtaining attention, this one tends to be some of the simplest to identify and define, and maybe more the most challenging to plan for. But obtaining attention from significant others is generally the target of obtaining attention. This would be defined often as a hard time being away from parents. What it can look like, and what gives us a really good clue into this, is if it's not just the student isn't just avoiding school, but they're avoiding any separation from parents. So that includes like sleepovers or birthday parties, being dropped off with other family members. Those are all pretty good indicators that this might be our function of behavior here. The attendance pattern is often like beginning of the day, trouble getting to school. But once they're at school, like they're doing okay. I did have a case where, it started as a morning and ended up escalating to like the student just wouldn't get to school at all during the day. But it was very much it was very mom centric for the student. And so the concerns, this might be expressed from the student as worrying that something might happen to their mom or to their family. It can occur following major changes. There's sometimes adjusting to big moves, or changing in household dynamics. Divorce would be a great example. Sometimes can bring this kind of behavior out. And it can also look like a frequent desire to check in with parents. Our last function here would be attaining tangible. And so what that looks like for a lot of people, it can be infinitely varied, of course, but Bueller might be a great example of that, where enjoying sleeping in late, watching TV, video games, substance use can also be there, right? There's something that's drawing them out of school. It's a specific activity or thing they want to engage with. So again, what we're looking for functional behavior assessment is reviewing first and foremost. You get as much information as you can from existing products that are in the school. So oftentimes it's going to be attendance records, where you can look at patterns of time of day, days of the week, periods. Sometimes you can see changes at home and documentation through school files. I would also say, if this is something that the parent is already partnering with you on, if you can look at records from counselors or psychological evaluations that can really help with that, or even physical like health charts. Those all can be really, really insightful or help you rule out specific concerns even that are coming through before you even have the chance to or feel like you have the need to do an interview. So it can be really helpful for ruling in things and also ruling out things. Interview, I always recommend, depending on your phase in the process here and your level of involvement, but I'm assuming any student that you're working with individually, there's probably going to be some level of like discussion with staff, first. But this also might come from parents first. Like, I can't get my student to school. So getting as much information as you can about the specific circumstances in which the student's refusing, the theory they might have of why is all going to be tremendously helpful in your functional behavior assessment here. I don't want to understate, though, that asking a student directly what's going on can be really helpful, too. They are often the most insightful into their own behavior. Sometimes not, but oftentimes they will give you perspectives that they haven't shared with anyone else because no one's asked them directly or asked them in that way, or asked them from the perspective of, someone neutral coming in, right? Oftentimes as a school psych, I was someone that wasn't tied to their prompts. I wasn't tied to trying to drag them out of the bed in the morning. It's just like, hey, I'm trying to understand this a little bit more. Can you share a little bit about like what your morning routine is, how that looks, what you're feeling at the time, what are the thoughts going through your head, that kind of thing. All right, so on the side of observation, I did mention a little bit of this already, but observing behavior directly is something that can be really helpful for, I would say, functional behavioral assessment in general. It's something that's a little bit more challenging to do in a school setting for some of these non-attendance behaviors because you don't get to be there. Sometimes you can do home visits to observe a family routine. I haven't done that personally, but that can be something helpful for identifying what is the antecedent, the thing happening before the school refusal behavior occurs. You can define then what the behavior looks like in across settings, and then what is the observed consequence? What is the thing that happens for or to the student, or does the student gain access to as a result of that school refusal behavior? And so the goal of this kind of observation is to establish a pattern of this is what the student reliably gets after the behavior. This might be then the function of the behaviors to obtain that thing. Like I said, that's something I've found limited success with. Typically, the interview and the review can be much more informative overall to the picture. Nonetheless, if you got a student with the high needs, that's a piece that I check off to make sure that I've done. The last piece, though, testing, I have used this as well in a couple different cases. And I'm just going to plug a couple considerations for this. The first one is the school refusal assessment scale for children. This is a scale that's developed by Kieran and colleagues. I think there's a revised version out as well. That is a questionnaire that students fill out, or you can fill out, I think, on behalf of the student, depending on how it works. But it has a series of questions, probably a couple dozen, as I recall it. And this will help you identify function because each question leans toward one function or another. And so you get an affirmative answer for one question versus another. You get a pattern of yeses and nos. And you basically add up points in each category function. Now, I've used this 2 times, and both times I found that I was stuck between 2 functions. I needed to investigate further anyway, but that could be a resource for you to relatively efficiently come up with a direction to go here. It does take some student time to administer, but not more than probably 10 or so minutes, as I recall it, and could be an option. The last one that I'll mention is one that is more time intensive. It's a concurrent operant assessment. This is something that does require additional training. It's something that I did at Heartland AEA I'm trying to think. I think I did it with one school refusal case because we were so caught between, is this a tangible function or is this an attention function? And I was convinced, the school refusal assessment got me, yeah, it could be either one. They were dead even. And I was thinking this is about tangible. And so what the concurrent operant assessment does is it presents students with two choices over and over again, two different choices. And you go down different pathways depending on what the choices are. But the choices are effectively like, here's a condition where you can have, the most preferred item, the tangible item that they like, or you can just hang out with a preferred person, or at least a neutral person that is friendly and that will talk to you and feed kind of that attention function. So they get to choose which one they want to do for a couple minutes. And based on which one they choose, that can inform, and they can change it anytime. That'll inform which direction maybe that function goes. And so it's a repeated testing of different conditions that are similar, might overlap with some of these functions, but can give you a good sense of direction. So that actually pushed me in what ended up being a very successful direction for the student. If it was actually an attention function and not a tangible access to video game function. So all that to be said, training is required. Investigate with your local agencies what support they might have for that, but I did find that to be quite helpful. It looks like Kelly shared schoolavoidance.org website that has the school refusal assessment scale. Thank you for sharing that, Kelly. There was a link in here, but it's hard to access that at the moment. Okay, a couple other assessments that I'll mention here. School anxiety scale, school anxiety inventory, the school refusal evaluation scale. That school refusal evaluation scale, I think, is going to be similar to the one that I already talked through. But the school anxiety scale and inventory here are going to give you a little bit better sense of like the subjective ratings of how anxious they are. And so you can think about this as like a pre-post kind of evaluation, or even a progress monitoring if you really wanted to do that. I'm not sure about the sensitivity for that specific measure for that progress monitoring piece, but knowing that you can assess the anxiety aspect of this in a bit more formal way than the subjective units of stress is kind of the point that I want to communicate here. And because anxiety has become a big piece of the discussion of this, I do want to acknowledge a couple aspects of, like how we think about the anxiety chain and how that can inform intervention. Ultimately, we have this cognitive triangle of, when we talk about like cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's this basic idea that behaviors, thoughts, and feelings all interact with each other and can kind of be reinforcing in different ways. It doesn't necessarily start with any one or another, but does give us different starting points depending on what we identify the student might need support with, and curriculum can support this too. But basic examples of anxiety and how this can emanate in school refusal, it can start with feelings like, I feel sick, that I have to go to school, my head hurts. That then gets to, well, I'm going to be embarrassed if my head hurts, or if I need to vomit or something. And then it results in the behavior of like, I'm not going because this is all going to happen. But conversely, it can start with, I hate school and, they can't make me go. And now because I've had all these thoughts, it becomes a physical reaction of like, oh, I'm not feeling well. And then that results in behavior. Or it can start with behavior. I think about this. If you've got a little one in particular, you've seen school refusal in some form or another. My 5-year-old was giving this to me yesterday. Started with crying, whining about something else, and then it turned into, well, I don't want to go anywhere. And then that can result in those physical or otherwise feelings of like nauseousness and other symptoms. So understand that this can start in a few different ways, and that we can intervene on each one to try and resolve some of this anxiety that contributes to the school refusal. All right, so let's talk about intervention now. And that is, of course, like identifying what we should do and how we should do it. Now, I really wish this approach worked for students as well as it might work for teachers. But the gentle nudges at the point of students chronically non-attending, refusing school, this will be too light of a touch. But I'm glad that most teachers are able to respond at least with this approach if they need it at all. I'm going to start here on intervention approaches because there's a lot to tackle here, and so I did my best to organize this in a way that made sense. So first, I'm going to just talk about the broad intervention considerations, how I think about selection and choices with each component, and then I'll talk about what are some very broad strokes considerations for Tier 1 and Tier 2 programming around non-attendance, and then we'll get into the Tier 3 individualized plans with a couple examples there, including adaptation, sustainability, and fading. So fundamentally, when I'm selecting an intervention, the first and foremost thing that I consider in the programming of that is what have I identified as the function of the behavior. That drives so much of the plan, and I think does the most to determine its success or failure, aside from the implementation of it after that. But we also need to provide instruction on skills. And so that's going to be, it's not just going to be like reinforcement or taking away access to what we identify as the function, but it's also going to be like giving the students skills to access things along the way that they can be more independent in advocating and accessing on their own. And then, scheduling reinforcements is absolutely going to be a piece of this, trying to set up the situation for the student in a way that makes it more likely for them to attend and less likely to engage in school refusal behavior. And then the last piece is only going to be for Tier 2 and Tier 3, but fading and maintenance of supports. So at the intervention for Tier 1 level, we discussed these barriers at the front of the presentation here. It's important to acknowledge that like some of these are really hard, especially I think about in particular like rural communities have these problems of deserts in terms of resources. But I do want to acknowledge that there are things that we can do that are pretty straightforward to promote access for all students to the educational environment. Some of them may be intuitive, may already be existing. And so if that's the case, love it. But hopefully, if you're struggling with this as a Tier 1 issue, there might be something that sparks here for you. So for illness, dental problems, mental health issues, it's really helpful if schools can partner with free clinics that are available or community-based organizations that can connect with health clinics. School-based health centers are becoming more popular as well. I would say like even the number of resources that are available are often very obvious to the school staff in the building, but dissemination of that availability of like declaring that so that everyone knows like, oh, there's like a wealth of resources within the building that I send my student to every day. The connection with that can actually be simpler, and like it can prevent a lot of issues around these fronts here. So advertising that, facilitating that if at all possible. So like saying, hey, this like you're referring them to the doctor, like you call on their behalf, or you say, hey, can you call this student's family? Here's the information if you have permission for that. Those can be really life-changing connections. I would also say, if you're thinking about that advertising, like you have school pamphlets or newsletters that go out, thinking about language accessibility is really, really important. If you've got it just in English, I guarantee you're missing someone. Think about other languages that to be spoken. Think about specifically, if you have an identified group at Tier 1 level of students that are not attending that have a linguistic similarity, think about how you can get materials translated. That might be a really cost-efficient means of drawing more students into needed resources. Transportation issues, pretty straightforward there, but connecting with bus tickets or ride shares, financial issues, in the high school level in particular, there might be, poverty is of course a problem. Students might feel a need to work more than attend school. And I've had this happen more than once, and I'm sure all of you probably have examples of that as well. But thinking about how, okay, acknowledging for that student, I think school is important, but you think work's really important. How can we make this work experience valuable in terms of your education? Course credit is a great way to do that. You try and structure that a bit more. You try and work with the employer directly to understand what the nature of the work is, how they can structure some goals around proficiency in that area of work. That can be something that genuinely is meaningful for graduation. And oftentimes schools have programs for this. It might be a matter of expanding or working with a different employer. Free lunch programs, clothing drives are always going to draw more in. So if you have the ability to do that, access to clothing is one that's probably less talked about than free lunch programs. But would you just think about social barriers that might exist around that, or self-consciousness with that? For students that have obligations outside school, having available remote instruction opportunities. This is blown up in popularity over the last several years. Sometimes I think to the detriment, but oftentimes in cases where students are not attending, this can be a foot in the door. If you have an opportunity like that, I'm always hopeful that if a student is otherwise physically able and time-wise able to engage in school, that this could be part of the stair step back into the school building. But this for students that have other obligations and just literally the school days at a time that they cannot get in, having these asynchronous programs or programs that can be supported, outside of school hours are really can be really trajectory changing for these students. Another aspect to think about, and this one will be, I don't think earth-shattering for anyone, but having a social worker that can provide connections for families with county, state, local, or even federal resources, right? Getting into aid programs, SNAP would be a great example of one. Food stamps, having someone to facilitate that can ease the burden on a family and make a student more able to attend or attend more healthfully. And the last one of the last ones that I'll talk about here, sleep. I would just want to point out that there is a lot of research pointing out that there are circadian rhythms for adolescents that just shift later in that time. And a lot of school districts have shifted their school days for middle schools and high schools a half an hour later. The really early schedules for middle schoolers and high schoolers just don't work. There's some of the worst attended sections of the day, and that has implications that add up over time, and result in some grouchiness too. I'm sure some of you can attest to. So if you are in a position of an administrator or have the ear of an administrator, considering adjusting schedules if you've got really tier 1 chronic non-attendance there. And the last barrier being cultural disconnect. That's a piece that we can. I can't prescribe a specific action to overcome that. I think that comes from a lot of listening and creating opportunities to listen. There are, again, different priorities, different levels of trust that are well-founded, I would add. There are a lot of, for example, indigenous tribes in Oregon here that have a profound distrust of anything tied to the government because there have been repeated instances of going back on agreements and even boarding schools, if you haven't heard about that, an atrocious history of our country. So a cultural disconnect and distrust of school systems and is more than any one person can probably bridge, but starting a conversation and a dialogue about what we're trying to do in school, what that means for their student, what that can mean for their student, and how we can still consider their values in that education and what that can look like. That's a lot of conversation, understanding seeking, and things like that. So it's a lot, but hopefully this gives you some ideas and places to start. And I'm always happy to chat about this after as well. Okay, so intervention at tier 1. I would say, like broad strokes here, when we think about those predictors of truancy, that are aside from those like specific barriers that we're touching on. Initiatives focused on improving school climate. I have to plug positive behavioral interventions and supports. It's an area of focus for me because the research supports it, and I really believe that this is a great starting point for any MTSS system, targeting behavior. It is the most popular in that regard. It's the most widely disseminated, and is documented over and over again to improve school climate, improve how students perceive their schools and their staff. Other things that you can do outside of that, engaging in attendance initiatives. This is like emphasizing attendance, celebrating attendance, recognizing that and talking about it a lot. There are an infinite number of ways of doing this, but thinking about how you can build recognition into like a weekly announcement where you're like, hey, so-and-so is here every day this last week. And, we've got this number of students that were here every day over the last month, and holy cow, we're going to maybe have some token economies that are there. There are tons of ways to do this, but making it a part of the culture that values and celebrates attendance, I think, is probably one of the cheapest ways to probably tackle this at a tier 1 level. Programmatically, social emotional learning, as I talked about before, self-regulation is one of those individual student predictors of attendance. And so if we are instructing on that at a tier 1 level, showing students how to use calming strategies, thinking about planning, thinking about delayed gratification, those kinds of things, like understanding that school is important. Like those are all going to be super valuable in this effort at a tier 1 level. And then the last one that I'll mention here is deepening connections in the classroom. This one admittedly did not come through in that systematic lit review, but it's one of those, like, it's school climate adjacent. But the more connected students are to their peers, staff in the buildings. Thank you, Valerie, for posting the link in the chat there. That is going to make quite an impact. And I work on a couple studies that do include at least one of these strategies in their approach, and they get profound effects as a package. But greeting students at the door, there's even individual studies on that have found that can be profoundly effective on its own. And that's about as simple as it sounds, like greeting every student by name at the door, positive affirmation, and give them a little bit direction of where to get started. Really good. The 2x10 strategy is another one that I want to point out is really helpful. And it's just identifying that if we talk to students for 10 days in a row for 2 minutes, like a one-on-one session, this is specifically for students that are struggling, but still more of a tier 1, I would say, intervention of like every student could get this. It's an unconditional piece of attention. It's an unconditional relationship building piece, getting to know the student. You might have like a question of the day. You're like, I want to ask you about like something you enjoy doing outside of school, or I want to ask you about, let's talk about favorite foods. Like, it doesn't have to be about school. It doesn't have to be about anything in particular, but establishing a regular, positive social connection with students. All right. This is another area that often becomes a contributor to non-attendance. So is that oftentimes there's a feeling from schools like, well, students not attending, we have to do something about that. Like we have to respond to that in a way. And the school discipline system has kind of become a default in a lot of cases for that. My recommendation for consequences for non-attendance would be inform parents promptly, make sure that they're aware, and support a prompt return of the student to school. I do not suggest suspending students for non-attendance. Telling a student they can't come because they haven't been coming is a little bit outside of the realm of logic for me. I understand that it's been a go-to, but as I mentioned before, it's not going to improve attendance. I mean, by definition, you're mandating worse attendance. So thinking around that would be my maybe the least harmful suggestion I have. So tier 2 would be looking at those social emotional learning groups. What I described in tier 1, applying that to tier 2, but with increased opportunities for practice and reinforcement. I love when these curricula align with tier 1 instruction. If we can use the same language in tier 2 as we use in tier 1, then all those tier 1 prompts that teachers are giving in the classroom are going to, like, there's just a one-to-one correspondence, and the students are cued in and know what the expectation is and can follow that more readily. I also want to mention check in, check out as being an option. You know, you've got small groups of students that are falling out attendance-wise. You might adapt a check in, check out system, which is often based on school-wide expectations and feedback each period. You know, like you can build in reinforcers that are for attendance at the end of that day as well, check-ins on attendance, reinforcing that they are here. Sometimes that becomes a bit of that routine and check and check out anyway, but making that an emphasis, especially for students that have more of an attention maintained behavior. All right, so tier 3 here. For me, function always is going to guide the plan. My plan is going to look profoundly different for reinforcers and skills taught, depending on what I've identified as the function, whether it's escape, attention, or tangible. I also want to emphasize here that the school is not the only place in which intervention will take place. Partnering with families cannot be overstated as like how important that is. It's one of those things I've talked about in assessment, but like in intervention, it's equally, if not more important, because the situation that the student is often in, at least in the most severe cases, is they are in the home when they're not at school. That's not always true. Sometimes students are out and about and doing other things, but parents are your access point to their home life, and can provide the supports that or remove some of the maintaining conditions in the home that'll make it more likely that the student attends. So making sure that the parent is on board, aware, and keyed into function of behavior, and even partnering with some of the reinforcement if possible. I don't like taking things out of the school's control for that personally as a school site, because I can't always see it, but like really good coaching on the importance and the delivery of reinforcement and scheduling of that can all, it can be very powerful, and sometimes it's necessary. Like it truly is necessary for, let's say, attention maintained in particular. Like that becomes really important. If the thing the student needs most is attention from their parent for doing things, like you have to try and guide the parent into what that looks like and what that can look like to get the student into school. For physical intervention, or for intervention, I always want to make sure that physical complaints are addressed. This means, you know, if you've got somatic complaints, I want as much as we can to facilitate a doctor's checkup, or if it hasn't taken place already. I want to rule out things that could just be genuinely like GI distress, right? The student might have some disease or other disorder that is causing physical issues that like they can't attend. And you don't want to be in the position of creating a behavior plan for a student that just has a physical ailment, because there's just something that really rubs wrong about that. So always get that checked out to the extent that you can before, like in earnest, starting a strict like behavioral function-based program. So therefore, my assumptions are medical issues are not a key barrier. to attendance when I'm starting a program like this. I'm also assuming that academic programming is appropriate for student skills, because that alone can be a reason for avoidance. So understanding that like academic programming is where it needs to be. I also want to make sure that language is accessible for students. So like we're not presenting that as like they don't know what's going on or what's expected, because language is a fundamental barrier that needs to be addressed first. And that family is engaged with or supporting of the intervention plan. Like I already hit that one, but like worth repeating, the engaging families can sink or swim in an intervention plan. When we're preparing to implement, this is how IO had it set up. So Rochelle, you would know this at Great Prairie as well. IO instruction plan, behavior intervention plans broke things down by instruction, antecedent strategies, response strategies, and safety plans. And so this is how I have been trained and will continue to write them, because I think it's a nice way to structure our plans. As I mentioned before, they're going to be function-based, provide instruction, schedule reinforcements, and include fading and maintenance plans. Fundamentally, the function-based plan is going to limit access to reinforcement for non-attendance. We are going to reward attendance in structured ways, and we are going to provide skills that promote access to the function in an acceptable manner. And I'll give examples of that in a minute. And then we're going to provide skills that reduce the power of the function. And a lot of times this just means like the setting event for a lot of students might be actually that they're like having trouble with anxiety, and it gets worse there. So if we can help them manage anxiety in advance, that might make the power of escape a lot less potent for them. So the anxiety chain, all we're trying to do is instruct. When we're providing instruction, we want to normalize that anxiety is a part of life, and that it's something that we can handle through daily practice of relaxation techniques, and we can monitor that. For anxiety-based treatment of this, oftentimes what this looks like is creating a step ladder around fear. So understanding for students what is the progression of things that are most fearful to least fearful, and thinking about how we can graduate them through those least steps to the point where probably the most is like attending a full day or attending the one class that they're most worried about. Within the anxiety chain, a couple strategies for helping coach students through this would be the STOP plan, the fear plan. The STOP plan is asking a few key questions that help root the student in what are things that they can engage with that help pin down what their anxiety is, and things that they can do about that. So asking, am I scared or nervous about a certain situation? What thoughts am I having? What other more realistic thoughts can I have instead? So you're kind of pivoting or reframing. And then praise themselves for thinking more realistic thoughts, right? So we're pivoting to a more actionable state of mind there. So this gets into the attention cycle for students when we think about the functional base. So I'm just trying to give you some background of like the logic of selection of intervention. For an attention cycle, if a student is engaging in a problem behavior and the response to that is a lot of yelling, lecturing, criticism, negotiation, whatever, basically the student that they're engaged with in a way that allows them to continue avoiding or continue to get that attention, rather, they're going to continue doing that, right? So if we're reinforcing that in circles, we don't get a behavior change. If we can engage with positive behavior, formal rewards for attending, access to friends or privileges, and then having formal consequences for negative behaviors that don't include attention, that becomes a more positive attention cycle there. And so we've got that same logic for escape as well. It's that cycle of like, we're trying to break that and insert a more positive cycle. And so what I have here are a few plans, and I'm just going to go through one, and there are going to be a couple others for you. But for you to review in the slides. I'm going to go through the attention plan here, which for me was a student that was in middle school and was struggling with anxiety, particularly around being away from mom. And so her instruction consisted of like coaching strategies on identifying things in her surroundings, the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 strategy, which is just identifying things in her surroundings that she can see, hear, feel, touch, and smell. But it also involves communicating, taking breaks, so telling us when she's feeling that anxiety and needs to take a step out of class, because that was something that she found helpful and worked quite well. Antecedent strategies for her, we started with a preferred activity when she arrived on time. So it was a nice way to start the day positively. And then if she was attending regularly through the week, she got a Friday lunch with her mom for meeting attendance targets. It was really great and worked really well. And we were able to phase in classes over time with that structured mom reinforcement at the end of the week. We also did some phone calls for meeting intermediate goals as well. So calls from to mom from home as a way of like allowing her to connect and also talk about how well she's doing. It was really cool, double attention for the things that she was doing right and that were helping her out. We did add a class period after 2 weeks of 90% attendance. And so that was like, once we saw success, we slowly phased in class periods and built her up from there. Response strategies, when she was refusing at school, refusing not at school, the parent would prompt her to use that strategy and remind her of the incentives available at school, including lunch with mom with her favorite meal. And then if she was refusing at school, she'd be reminded of breaks that were available and using breathing strategies that we were teaching at the time. So sometimes you use multiple strategies and figure out which one the student gets. Breathing strategies we found to be more helpful in the moment for that student. And this student didn't need a safety plan, but there could be others that do for elopement or threatening self-harm. So I'm going to skip through to establishing a goal, and then we'll have enough time for questions at the end here. So for this student, it was, for most students, I would say a shorter term plan of 4 to 12 weeks is what we expect for getting a student back on track with attendance. It could be longer if you're really starting from baseline of 0. It can be hard to build sometimes a momentum at that early phase. But overall, you want goals to be pretty specific about who's going to do what by when. And then once you've achieved that goal, establishing fading goals is, I think, really, really important for weaning off of supports. So the example goal written up there is, by June 17th, Casey will attend an average of 95% of their full schedule, which would be 8 full periods for 2 consecutive weeks. And so that for us was a measure of success for this student. And of course, noting that, appointments and other things shouldn't be counted in there because those are not absences within the student's control. This is a photo from a trip that I recently took, and I was riding a bike, and I'm not really in shape for riding a bike right now, but I was supposed to climb that huge mountain up there, and you can tell that's far away and really high up. And I was really daunted, and I didn't really have a sense of how far along I was. I was about halfway from where I started on this one. I felt like I should have been done. So understanding that gradual exposure and milestones can be really helpful for building a sense of accomplishment. I did not feel accomplished here. And it took me a while to get there. But students with reduced schedules, in particular, are going to need some milestones, and I think can be really helpful for that. And so if we've got a goal of 95% attendance, starting from 25% attendance, having a milestone of 50% attendance, where it's something that we celebrate, we get to, like having intermediate goals can be really important. And opportunity to provide extra reinforcement for our students. Implementation fidelity is another one that is often overlooked. Like, we're just measuring, are we doing what we said we do? And so creating a checklist of instructional strategies, the antecedent response strategies, and the safety plan. Are we implementing things? These are often done as self-checks by school staff. Can also create one for parents to help keep them on track and keep them, that often helps like delineate what precisely are your responsibilities. It's helpful for everyone, but structuring that for parents, I think, is something that was welcome from my perspective, from their perspective, sharing with me. And of course, celebrate small successes, both in terms of implementation and in terms of the student milestones. And so things don't always go according to plan. If you're evaluating what happens here for your intervention, and things are like not going well, this is not what you do. Okay, just don't do this. Sometimes this feels like a default. Don't do that. If a student's not progressing, one of the first things I want to do is reevaluate the function of behavior. If it's like, I'm usually pretty sure about that when I'm intervening, but if you're kind of like unsure and it was going to go either way, you might consider changing that routine. You also want to check implementation fidelity. Are we actually providing the reinforcement? Are we actually providing the instruction? Another aspect here is checking access to non-scheduled reinforcement. So are they getting access to the function of behavior in ways that we didn't account for, and therefore it's not really enticing to be at school because we haven't done that. And last, beyond that, maybe we need to increase our reinforcement schedule, make it more frequent, or make it more powerful for the student, make it easier to obtain some measure of those. There might also be a circumstance shift, so it's important to check in with parents, with students, understanding what's going on. You might adapt because in a positive way, like students on meds, and that has drastically changed their tendency to avoid. And so now they're actually attending much more. And so you might jump the plan a little bit, but still celebrate, holy cow, you're doing so well, and providing reinforcement along the way. If a student communicates a preference for like, oh, I don't want to attend this class, but I will attend this one, listen to that, get them in the door. That is the priority. So if they're like, this class isn't working for me, adapt. Let them get into a different one. We want behavioral momentum. We want this to build up, especially if that's early in the plan. If things are going well, that's awesome. Don't change it. There's a temptation sometimes to drop sports really quickly when a student's doing well. Don't do it. Establish a new routine. It takes weeks to establish a new behavioral routine. Let them sit with that support for a while. They are successful, and then we'll fade. Planning for success here. There are, when we're thinking about sustainability, make sure when you're writing out that plan, everyone's on board for this can be implemented for 4 to 12 weeks. The supports we can maintain for 4 to 12 weeks. That comes from school side and also the parent side. When we're thinking about fading, we're talking about maintaining high attendance and gradually reducing supports from there. I think that ramp up and establishing milestones going up, we're still establishing milestones, but we're fading our supports with those milestones. So same thing with the fade plan. We're establishing goals of reduced support, and we're going to stick to those plans of gradually fading while the student maintains the level of success that we expect. We still want to incentivize that. We can gradually fade those as well, ideally, but always maintain in your head, like there's a function here that we want to stay in front of. We want to keep the student reinforced for attending and continue to celebrate, because this is one of those things. I can't oversell the idea of celebrating small successes. We had a student last year that was in 8th grade going into 9th grade and end of the year, and he had a lot of ups and a lot of downs, and was more down toward the end of the year, but we celebrated at the end of that school year. Like, look what you're able to do. You came every day for 3 weeks. You were doing your work. Like, you showed you can do this. And this student was on track to probably drop out halfway through high school. And we got a call from his mom, because I didn't follow him to the high school. Call from his mom saying he has had such success in high school. Now, there could be a lot of things that go into that I was not a part of in high school, but this was a student that I may not have attended at all to start high school, right? Like, intimidating shift, new peers, but he attended. He started doing his work more. Like, he found that success early, and while struggled, like he knew he could do it. So don't underestimate the power of that. All right. So including my presentation here, I just want to plug a couple resources that I think can be helpful for you all. One, this brief is available on the Center for PBIS website. So you're welcome to check that out as a really like a condensed review of what I've got here in this presentation. A couple books. I don't like giving a lot of resources. I find when I'm given a lot of resources, I almost don't look at any of them. So here's just a couple books that I think are really good references for tackling this. One is Kearney, Helping School Refusing Children, and their children I actually have right here. This is a good book. There's an updated version out that I do encourage you to check out. And then Tackling Attendance Challenges. This is going to be more of like the tier 1 level kind of supports administrator orientation, kind of for leadership and what changes you can make there. So yeah, with that, Valerie's prompted. If you have any questions, please share them in the Q&A. Sorry, I didn't give as much time for that, but hopefully you all found those slides, those last slides, pretty useful for the topic. So I will, while we're waiting for questions to come in, I'll just plug, like, if you do have any follow-ups, please feel free to reach out to me at shai@uoregon.edu. I'm happy to answer any other questions and follow up with you on individual needs.
Thanks, Sean. I think that your presentation is really appreciated, and we have a couple of questions that did come up in the Q&A tab. From Kelly, she's wondering about any examples of fidelity checks for behavior plans.
Okay, so I'll ask. Kelly's is a straightforward. I don't think I have a physical like example of fidelity checks, but I could find one for you, Kelly, if you want to. I don't have one that I can throw up right here. But if you want to email me, I'm happy to follow up with you and provide an example there. I think I might have to make it, but it would be fairly straightforward. And it's often, it literally looks like a checklist. You can have gradations of implementation of each strategy, but I prefer as simple as you can make it. Was this strategy implemented at the frequency and duration that we expected it to be? Is the reinforcement delivered? Was the instruction provided the appropriate dosage? Did we do it every week? It can be a daily or a weekly thing, depending on the rigor of that behavior plan. So there's lots of varieties. I would say most often weekly checks are going to be the most feasible for most educators and families as well. Okay, and then Anonymous was asking suggestions for a student with an emotional impairment that has truancy issues, but when at school has behaviors that lead to removal from school. I feel like we have tried everything last year. I would need to know a little bit more, to be honest. Oh wait, and there's a show more button here I'm seeing. Oh, no, that's it. That was deceiving. This is where, emotional impairment, I assume what you mean there is like, you have a student that's like emotionally labile, likely to act out in a way that is maybe disruptive to the environment or possibly even aggressive. I start thinking there about, again, have we identified function of behavior? Like that's going to be my first one. Like what's most likely to set the student off? What are the skills that we prepared that student with? And yeah, what are the contingencies that we have in place to support that student? Oftentimes for a student that has, I would say that lives more in the moment, which might describe this student, the frequency of reinforcement that's available and the dynamic way in which you might change activities, right? Like sustained attention sometimes is a barrier here. It's hard to know without getting further in, but hopefully I've given you a few ideas on that.
All right. Thank you, Sean. We had a few other backup questions, but I think that we're at 12:14, so we'll stop there. Everybody, make sure you grab the sketch code in the chat. Otherwise, thank you so much for some great information. I really appreciated the way that you framed it in the problem solving process. So that was really helpful for a lot of our people that are supporting and working in teams.
Great. Well, thank you, Valerie, and thank you everyone for attending. And yeah, please reach out if there are resources that I didn't provide or ones that were inaccessible. I'm happy to help. That's why I'm here.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Shelley. You're welcome, Mark.
Mhm.
And you're welcome, Tammy, too. And Valerie, I would love if you do have a feedback survey. I would love to see that feedback if you're sharing that with session presenters.
Yeah,
That'd be
yeah.
great.
I think Jessica is probably going to share those, but I will double check that with her. Absolutely.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We
All right,
appreciate
yeah,
your time.
I'm gonna take off.
Okay.
And yeah, let me know if you need anything else.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.